Hi, I'm Tim Zacharias with Cougar USA and your host of Building Value. My guest today is Dr. Gavin Dillingham, Vice President of Research, Energy and Air Quality for HARC. Welcome to the show, sir.
Well, thanks, Tim. I appreciate being here today and look forward to our conversation.
Awesome. I'm very excited about this episode. We're going to be talking about HARC and its purpose. Also going to be talking a lot about ESG and net zero carbon and their impact on the built environment. On Building Value, we go behind the scenes of building operations to showcase the people and products that make buildings work and the value they bring to the community. Well, can you just give us a quick update on your current role and a little bit about HARC?
Sure. So currently I'm leading both our energy group and our air quality group at HARC, and the energy piece focuses mainly on decarbonization of our energy systems, whether that's building optimization or deployment of microgrids or looking at the transformation of our overall power grid, and then also looking at the resilience of our power systems.
Yep.
Looking at, in this case, trying to better value resilience in our microgrids and just in the work we do. So when that becomes part of the financial decision-making process, people have a better feel for the value they're getting.
Sure.
For that. So
yeah, I think that resiliency and that continuity is
right.
For some it can be very easy to value, right? If there's like a production process or something, you can easily see what the downtime costs. But for a lot of things, it's a little more intangible.
Very much so. Yeah.
So to be able to measure that and show that, I think is very valuable.
Just a lot of uncertainty around the timing and the likelihood and the duration of these events, and so kind of getting a better idea of what that looks like is key to make people more comfortable with using those kind of resilience metrics.
Sure. And our conversation last year was about a lot about resiliency of the power grid in Texas after the freeze, and so I'm sure that's been a topic that more people are
very much so. Yeah.
Much more top of mind this year. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, very cool. So can you tell us a little bit about HARC and what its purpose is?
Sure. So HARC's been around now for about 40 years this year. We're celebrating our 40th anniversary. We've been here, in Texas, focusing largely on the Gulf Coast, really working on a variety of sustainability issues, whether that's air quality, water supply, ecosystem services, and then, as I said, the energy side of things.
Mm-hmm.
We also have been doing a good bit more work on kind of climate resilience in general and climate equity, and working within low-income communities to help them better prepare for and have access to, say, solar plus storage systems and weatherization of these homes. And once again, a lot of that came out of the Winter Storm Uri and the impacts that it had on kind of residential neighborhoods and the like. So
yeah, I think that revealed a lot of issues in the way that homes are built here or maintained, and opened a lot of people's eyes to what could go wrong.
Very much so.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, well, very cool. Well, last year, like I said, we talked about the bigger picture of Texas power and the resiliency as a result of that storm. What we'd like to talk about today is a little bit more kind of forward-looking and still related to the energy and air, but in the kind of terms of net zero carbon and all of the goals around that, and corporate ESG policies. What those are all about, and ultimately what's the impact to the built environment, how is this going to impact commercial buildings, and how people can prepare for it. So maybe a good place to start would just be with some definitions or kind of background about these topics. So I'd say maybe let's start with net zero carbon, going back to the Paris Agreement that the U.S. was initially in.
Right.
Then we were out, and now we're back in.
Right.
And I think it's safe to assume at this point, I think it's 187 countries or something like that are in this agreement, and so I think this is going to be the path going forward. So, what is that agreement, and how are people going to be impacted by that net zero carbon goal?
Right. So the primary focus there is to reduce the amount of carbon and decrease the amount of carbon going into the environment to maintain the overall Earth's temperature at 1.5 degrees or lower. And so that's really driving a lot of these activities around, becoming carbon neutral or, net zero goals. And a lot of those are, 2030, 2040, 2050. For example, the city of Houston, when we did their climate action plan, their focus is carbon neutrality by 2050 there. But it really depends on, kind of what industry and what organization you're talking to and what their, what's kind of the opportunities for them, because ultimately it has to be, for a business, it has to be an economic argument to take those types of steps.
Sure.
And so the fortunate thing is that when you look at the cost of, say, wind and solar and even battery storage, it's cost competitive with a lot of especially at the grid level for natural gas, compared to natural gas and coal and such. And that's why you see such a significant proliferation of renewables in ERCOT right now. And so what you see now companies doing to help get to those net zero goals are actual physical purchase, so power purchase agreements of these systems, and supporting the actual development rather than buying RECs or renewable energy credits.
Right.
And so you're seeing a significant growth in that space, especially among corporations. And then a lot of the companies we've been talking to are focusing a lot more on just kind of optimizing building operations. So they're looking for net zero energy, not whole building net zero at this point, because when you get to that, you're looking at the full life cycle of the building. So from sourcing of materials and the building and construction process all the way to operations and such. And although HARC, we've actually done a life cycle analysis of our building and got pretty close because we were intentional about doing that when we built our building. Most buildings have not gone those steps, and so their focus now is what does our operations look like to get to net zero and such. And so and so that's going to be largely, there's still so much opportunity for energy efficiency and just building optimization and continuous commissioning of buildings and knowing how your building's operating, because we have all these sensors and all this data coming in. There's just a lot of people just don't know how to actually use it and make decisions around it. And so we help companies do that. We're working with 3 different projects now, really helping companies put together like a sustainable facility management plan, strategic energy management, ISO 50001 energy management to better identify and use that data for them. As we were talking about earlier before we started here, one of our primary focuses is on plug load. You look at several of the newer commercial buildings around Houston, and plug load is the largest energy user there. Not the HVAC system, not the lighting system. It's plug load.
Yeah, it's really surprising.
And so when people don't understand that, it's hard for them to get to the goal they need to get to, because they're like, where is this energy coming from? I've, done everything I needed to improve my air conditioning system, but I'm still not getting down to where I need to be. And so trying to help people understand, there's a lot of different components that you need to be looking at, and there's ways in which to track it efficiently is key.
Right. And you mentioned a couple of things that I wanted to kind of touch on, and one of those was that difference between net zero carbon in terms of the Paris Agreement and what the goal is there versus being kind of carbon neutral, or that the negative connotation associated with that greenwashing. So that transition you talked about of actually purchasing directly of the renewable energy in that scope 2 area outside of what's happening in the building in scope 1. So moving to that from the credits, and that being more of that shift towards that net zero carbon, we're actually trying to reduce as much carbon emissions as you can on the scope 1, 2, and 3 of the building, and then actually doing capture and offset to get you over the hump down at the bottom, versus maybe not making a lot of changes to what you're doing in your operations and buying those credits to get you to carbon neutral. So very, very different targets, and I think it's good to hear that we're moving more towards that net zero carbon, and not from that carbon neutrality
exactly
part of it.
And one of the concerns that have been raised is when you're looking at offsets, where are those being generated from and who's generating them? And there needs to be better standards put around there, especially when you're looking at natural-based offsets, using farmland or forests and such, as far as, what's the longevity of that piece of land as far as being able to hold carbon there. If there's a forest fire, you're essentially lost your offsets there. Or if there's some sort of disturbance to that land, you've lost an offset. And so, looking at ways in which you potentially more kind of mechanically based carbon capture and storage, where you're putting it in those deep saline, aquifers, is kind of making sure that we're doing these offsets correctly and making sure they're properly, evaluated and the standards are in place to, make sure they're actually real. So.
Sure. And the one of the sites that I found in my research was the Science-Based Targets Institute, and they have a net zero standard, and they're kind of putting out some guidance based on different segments and industries, and their target shows a 90% reduction in scope 1.
Right.
Of carbon emissions, and then it's that last piece. So I think it's a much smaller piece of the pie, hopefully, that we're looking at doing these offsets and capturing things like that versus doing the actual work of reducing, which is, that's a huge ask, right? Especially in existing buildings to go 90% less. Yeah. So it's definitely, a lot of work to be done to get there, but I think, what y'all are doing in helping these buildings optimize or plan and do other things is part of the path to get there.
Oh. Yeah, absolutely. And that's you mentioned greenwashing earlier, and that was a big issue, is just people start claiming all these offsets and recs, and it's like, yeah, I don't know if you're really there or not. And so, and once again, it goes to, efficiencies. If it's, energy efficiency, water conservation, water use efficiency, material use efficiency, there's just so much work to be done there that we should be really focusing on that rather than trying to find an easy way of just grabbing some credits and taking advantage of that.
Yeah, and I agree. It's more of a shift in kind of the holistic approach of design to the building, more so than saying, okay, well, how can I, you're going to get to a limit where you say, okay, well, I want to pick the most efficient chiller, I want to pick the most efficient lighting or whatever. But at some point it's, okay, how are we designing all of this together and making the most efficient building overall?
Right. So. And then you got to operate it efficiently.
Sure. Right.
You can have the most efficient, chiller on the planet, but if you don't know what you're doing with it, it's
you want to keep your building at 65 degrees all the time.
It doesn't really matter. So
it's gonna drive that energy up. So, the somewhat related to this in a lot of ways has been and kind of a buzzword I feel like you see a lot is ESG, right? This environmental, social, and corporate governance that has been become very popular, especially with larger corporations, seeing a lot of ESG policies, a lot of ESG goals. And these are in a lot of ways tied closely to this net zero carbon goal. So what have you seen in this space and kind of how is HARC playing into these ESG policies?
Sure. Most of the focus when you look at ESG has been on environmental side of things, so emissions reduction, water conservation, any of the kind of potential impacts to emissions and such. And then followed by that, there's the governance piece to make sure that you're a good corporate citizen and that you're, have the appropriate controls in place to make sure that you're, taking steps to be a good steward of kind of your corporate
community.
The social piece is the area that we're actually getting a lot more questions on, and where there's probably the least amount of development is how do you ensure that the communities and the neighborhoods and kind of the social aspect is really considered within your operation, because that's much more difficult to quantify, maybe a economic benefit associated with that. And there's a lot of kind of, well, we've done some tree planting, or we built some houses, or we did, it's that type of stuff where you end up with corporations going in and kind of proposing ideas and kind of pushing their ideas of we need to do a social thing, so we're going to go do this. And what that turns out doing is you end up with communities that feel like they're getting maybe a bit burnt or not fully participating in that activity or having the opportunity to kind of really shape, this is really what we're needing. This is nice, but we really need this solved first. And so making sure that corporations are better understanding what's happening within the community and meet the community where they are. And so we're working with a variety of organizations now on how do you better make that connection, and looking at what's called co-creation or community-based participatory research, where if you are a corporation looking to engage within a community, that community isn't just there for you to, say, do this idea. It's the community is talking to the corporation saying, this is what we're looking at, this is what we're needing to do, and having them help kind of design the whole project or the effort that's going to be underway. And that's where the social piece really needs to come out. There's actually we're doing a talk tomorrow, and there's a study that came out that's looking at how we're going to build out the hydrogen hub in Houston. What is that going to look like? And what I noticed as I was reading through it is it's just talked about increasing demand for hydrogen and building out this infrastructure, and it talked about creating jobs as the first bullet point. But throughout the 15-point presentation, 15-page presentation, there was no mention of how those jobs are going to be created, how the people around the fence line communities are going to be impacted, how they're going to be engaged. And when you're looking at these kind of efforts these days, especially with the federal government type funding, because that's where this is going to get funded by, they have a Justice 40 initiative associated with it. And that means that a significant portion of that project needs to be engaged with the community. And it seems like we're still missing that. And it's
talking
like
to them instead of with them.
We need that piece. We can't be the saviors coming in, swooping in to save them. They've been there, they've done that, they've been burnt too many times. It's like, let us be part of that process. And so when you look at the ESG piece, the S part is really still needs a lot of development. And so we've seen a lot of, and I think corporations want to get better at it. And so that's why I think we're getting more phone calls on that and having more discussions around that. So.
Sure. And I think it kind of goes back to that term, the stakeholders, right? So, I mean, a lot of the ESG policies are driven by that stakeholder capitalism mentality or approach to running a business, and that being a very basically the opposite end of the spectrum from the shareholder supremacy or shareholder primacy that kind of drove the way the companies were ran in 80s, 90s, and probably into the 2000s, and basically saying that a company exists sole purpose to generate a profit for the owners, and now swinging the other way, saying, well, no, a company exists to beyond the purpose of beyond just creating profits, but for a better or higher purpose, and that being to serve it's all of its stakeholders and customers, employees, vendors, and the community and as a whole. And so I can see now you're moving from a single target to multiple, and how that can be a little fuzzy, right? To pick what is the who is the ultimate, or what is the ultimate purpose of the company. And so I think you're seeing now some more kind of guidance or maybe some boundaries built around this through the stakeholder capitalism metrics that came out through the World Economic Forum, and that's I think it's 21 primary and 30 something secondary metrics that are saying, okay, here's exactly how we can measure these ESG goals and policies. And I think that's going to help shape out what you're talking about, but also be able to add either that intangible value or actual economic value. And so, I think the more that gets adopted and it becomes more of like that gap accounting for these ESG policies, then it's going to help kind of shore those up. But like we were talking about earlier with the resiliency and that being difficult to measure, in talking with a lot of the property managers or building engineers, this actually gives additional ways to show value in the things that they're doing that don't necessarily hit the NOI directly. So what you mentioned a little bit on some of the things that y'all are helping on the social side. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how some of the these ESG policies are impacting the built environment?
I think what we did with the HARC building was very much informed by ESG there, and focusing mainly on once again the environmental impact this building is going to have, but then also how is it going to impact the employees and the community around it, and to make sure that we don't have a negative impact to our neighbors, and the neighbors, whether that's human neighbors or animal neighbors, because that
quite a few around here.
Yes, there's quite a few, and as you saw, as you came in, we have a few feral hog friends right now that we're trying to work with. But it's that having that social component that ensures that you have happy employees that are productive,
they have a safe, healthy environment to be in. All those things, sure.
Right, and the same with the governance side as well, is make sure that you're operating an organization that lives up to these values and standards in a way that everyone, the employees within there, are comfortable to live with and are happy to be a part of and such. And so I think it's driving a lot of how we're thinking about our buildings, especially when you think about the E and S side of things, keeping your employees productive, keeping your maintaining or reducing your emissions, reducing your overall environmental impact. And the thing with the E side now is a lot of this stuff is pretty cost effective to do. It's not, we're not talking about real, sexy new technologies. A lot of this stuff is, just is out there and available. It's a matter of how you bring the pieces together and
Sure.
how you manage the pieces. And that's what we really tried to do with our building here, is trying to demonstrate that.
Sure, and I think, like you said before, it was intentional, right? From the beginning through that design process, you had that goal in mind. And for new construction buildings going forward, it's a lot easier to start at that point, right?
Yeah.
But the majority of buildings that are going to exist in 2050 have already been built,
sure.
right? So you have this huge existing building market, or this huge built environment that is going to need to be upgraded or ran more efficiently to be able to keep up with these ESG goals, to be able to meet these net zero carbon goals. So is that, are some of the companies that you're working with coming from that side of the table, and how are y'all helping them, get up to speed?
Sure. A lot of that, having an existing building that, is going to last another, 50 years or so. You look at the materials that go into that building and maintaining that building for a long period of time and not tearing it down and putting up a brand new building. It's much more environmentally beneficial than, just keep, as we have a tendency to do in Houston, knock things down and build new things back up. And so, but when you look at, retrofitting these buildings, and we do quite a bit of this kind of work with folks to kind of figure out, how do you prioritize the retrofitting of these buildings?
Sure.
How do you look at these different systems and combine them in ways to where you get the most, beneficial return on investment and help you meet your goals there. As we were talking earlier about our building here and how we have, we're net zero and produce most of our power here on site. We've never thought about, disconnecting from the grid. And you run into those conversations where people are like, oh, we can disconnect from the grid when we, bring in all this new, microgrid and solar plus storage and all that. But that's not very practical. And so when we look at, the practicality of what people are trying to, or what, of these projects, it is, trying to make sure people are, practical. They understand what are the most likely benefits that they're going to receive from this. Make sure that they don't overstep things in many regards, because sometimes people do like to focus on the sexy, fancy things and not focus on building envelope stuff. And then the overall just management of the building, that's just so key. You have these buildings that start out as a LEED silver, LEED gold building, and you look at it a year and it's not even close to that.
Right.
It's, and so that's one of the key pieces of, if it's a new building or an existing building, you get the right measures put in place, retrofit. But then, it's really about the operations side of things.
Sure.
I mean, this building could be running horribly, but we focus specifically on making sure that we're, maintain an Energy Star score 99 and our, kind of our 13.5 EUI. I mean, that's just
very low.
What we want to, you put the processes in place, and it's not, once again, not that hard to do once you kind of get it in place to do it.
Right. And to be able to look and see through your energy management system that it's TVs being left on, or coffee makers or ice machines, those sort of things that are driving up your daily usage, you definitely are managing the building in a way where you're getting close to that net zero. So it's very impressive to see that, not only how the building was designed, but how y'all are running it to be able to keep it at that level.
Right.
And so, there's a couple of things that you mentioned that I thought were really interesting. The idea that, or that it's common in Houston to knock things down and rebuild them, and I definitely see that. But one of the projects that didn't take that path recently that was really cool was the post HDX building.
That's an awesome project.
And so it's really cool to see. I was in there right before the Super Bowl, and they kind of got it made ready, so to speak, to have a Super Bowl
lipstick on it.
It was definitely lipstick on a pig. That's the best way to describe what happened there. But what they've done since then, to go back now and see it, it's really cool. So you still have the kind of that older feel and culture, but all new inside. So it's very cool to see that, and I hope we see more of that. Keep that kind of feel. And the you mentioned the building envelope. I was having a conversation with a building engineer, and he was like, if they really wanted to make a big difference in this building, they wouldn't have me changing out the little flush valves. They'd put a whole new envelope around this building. And I kind of laughed and said, well, look, I completely agree with you, but I feel like these sort of goals and measures that are coming in, that we're seeing are going to help you justify that.
Right.
To go and say, look, it may not make 100% financial sense, with a straight ROI payback to totally redo the skin on this building. But if you look at these other goals that is going to help you move towards and look over the total life cycle of the cost, then it starts to make more sense. And so, I think the more that this becomes common practice, we're going to see more and more of those kind of longer, viewpoints, that life cycle cost being more the consideration than upfront price, hopefully, things like that. So it's, definitely seeing what you're seeing in the market as well.
Yeah, and if we could get away from these glass towers, and it's just, I mean, you in our building, you look at it, and we have big windows, but we also have a lot of just kind of wall space. But we have 75% of our office is natural light across the building, so it's not like impressive. You need to have these huge glass buildings to provide the daylight, and it's just you talk to these guys about the building envelope, and the gaskets between the glass starts breaking or starts, compromising. And it's just like, you really need a new.
And it's a lot of maintenance.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's a lot of maintenance. So anyway.
Very cool. So, I'd like to tap into your expertise on the energy side here. And we've talked a little bit about it, the scope 1, 2, and 3 of buildings. And, this kind of being defined as the way that a building or a company directly uses energy, the way they purchase it, and then the way their supply chain does, being those scope 1, 2, and 3s. How are you, I guess, what is some good ways that a company or a building could go about impacting each one of those scopes?
Right. Yeah. Scope 1 and 2 are definitely the easiest ones to take on. Scope 3 is, we talk with a lot of folks, and they're still just trying to figure out, how do I change, especially in the manufacturing industry space or in the oil and gas space, of how do I, mitigate those scope 3 emissions. But on scope 1 and scope 2, I mean, you have a lot more control over that for the most part. And that's going, for scope 2, it's, when you're looking at your new electricity contract, can you go out and do a physical purchase for a PPA of a solar wind farm? Can you consider, more on-site generation? What's the overall benefit look like for that? And on the scope 1 side of things, a lot of it goes to just, once again, the energy and water conservation that needs to happen within buildings that is that's just lacking so far. And, we need potentially better incentives around that, better understanding of participation in different types of utility, energy efficiency programs, the property assessed clean energy PACE program. Yep. Those types of funding mechanisms can help make those, pencil out a little better there. And it's good to see kind of growth and pace across Texas to really push that along. But yeah, it's just, once again, there's so much work that just can be done if we, and a lot of it has to do with making sure that your building managers or facility managers or energy managers are appropriately trained. They know what you look for. They have the appropriate incentives in place, because you run into issues where, these hot and cold calls, and their desire is, I just need to make this person happy. And so I go and flip the switch and put it into manual, and it takes it off, it takes it off the schedule. And then all of a sudden you have this building that's just blown up on you, and no one's looking to see why it's blown up, except maybe at the end of the month, someone may say, why are we paying more? But anyway, having better systems and better training in place to allow people to, reduce overall energy use, which reduces overall emissions within these buildings. And so that's, it's simple, not simple, but it's it's straightforward. They're just, got to have the incentives in place to have people to do it, and the desire to do that. So. Right.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the, we talked about it a couple times already, but that resiliency or that idea of adding more on-site generation and storage of power, whether it's through solar, like you talked about, or other ways, but that is going to be another way to, I feel like, incentivize or another thing that's going to draw people to do these things on site for that scope 2. Right. And then, that kind of ties into the next thing that I wanted to talk about is this, not a new idea of energy security, but maybe that it's kind of maybe coming back to top of mind with everything that's going on with Russia and Ukraine, and how that could impact the energy market. How do you feel that we can balance that need or want for energy security with energy and water security, really, with these ESG and net zero carbon goals?
That's a really good question. I think, what we're trying to, it still, I think, kind of goes down. I keep repeating this, but I think, a lot of it, if we want to talk about energy security, a good piece of that is reducing our demand for energy.
Absolutely.
So how do we reduce demand for energy? And then the other piece is making sure we have a diverse portfolio of supply that's coming in. We're not just dependent on, one or two pipelines or one or two sources that are coming into the country. And we do that for efficiency purposes, but that also makes your supply chain or the supply chain there really kind of fragile. And so you need a diversity of different types of resources that can provide, the supply that you need. But ultimately, or what needs to happen first is really, once again, reduce that demand as much as you can. And that's what, when we talk to people about they want to become, kind of, they want solar plus storage on their building so they can be more resilient and such, and have that energy security because they can't, afford to go down. The first thing we do is, so what can we do to reduce your overall energy demand? And once we get that figured out, you can optimize the size of your microgrid, whether that's a combined heat and power system or a combination of combined heat and power, solar and storage. And, and by providing those different resources, if there's an issue with the natural gas, at least you have some power coming from your battery and your solar storage, or vice versa, or whatever. And so that's one of the key pieces is, reducing demand and having a diversity of supply associated with that. And so I think that's, where we need to be largely focusing.
And ultimately, I mean, it sounds like the two are more complementary than opposing, right? I mean, that the moving towards reducing demand, having this multi-layered approach to your supply of energy and water are going to help reduce carbon and meet these ESG goals, as well as provide the energy security, right? So it's not necessarily mutually exclusive or even at odds with each other. I think, like what you're saying, is they can be complementary and work towards the same goal.
Right. And you see that, in Germany, where they have one of the more significant concerns is, unfortunately, it's kind of emergency measures, but the whole push is reduce the amount of energy you use. And so if you're a energy efficiency company in Germany, you should be out there just banging down doors and saying, all right, we got the solution for you. We can reduce your energy consumption by 20, 30% or 40% or whatever that number is if you do like a deep energy retrofit. And so, but yeah, it's really kind of overall reducing demand. And it's the same thing. I was I was listening to a podcast earlier today, and one of the main discussions around that was, they're talking about carbon capture, utilization, storage, and such. And the guy was asking, so when do we bring that in? And they're like, well, we bring that in kind of at the end, after we do material efficiency, circularity, energy efficiency, water efficiency, all these other pieces that can happen first because they're more cost effective. And then if we need the CCUS piece, then that comes in and picks up the rest of it. And so it's the same thing here. You do all these other upfront measures that reduce the amount of usage, and then you can kind of come in.
Yeah, and I think for some of the initial reaction to hearing about some of these net zero carbon goals or the ESG policies, they're like, it's kind of a burden. I already have to run a building, or I already have to run a business, and now I have to do all this other stuff. But I think when you look at it from this perspective, there is the potential for this to be not only not a financial burden, but actually financially beneficial. In a couple of ways. One, you're gaining efficiency, you're going to be saving more money, hopefully operating a more efficient building from that perspective. But also, you're going to be hedging against this risk that I think the financial institutions or green investors are going to be placing on these assets that aren't moving in this direction, that aren't keeping up. They're going to be seen as a risk or a devalued asset, and be kind of lowering the value on them. So I think financially it can align in the right direction as well.
Oh, I think so too. Absolutely.
So I think the overall kind of theme on this is just that, and it's kind of where we want to be, like what I was saying earlier, is in this idea of this kind of high performance solution, or one that is going to combine sustainable design, reliable, safe, and comfortable operation
Right.
with the lowest life cycle cost. And so I think if we can put it in that lens and say, look, whether or not you're looking for the energy security or to meet these net zero goals or these ESG goals, or just straight financial or good building operations, they're all kind of moving in the same direction.
Right. Right. Oh, absolutely. And I think, a lot of it when you're looking at, new construction or, renovation of existing buildings is get your architect, your MEP, your design firms, get them a little uncomfortable here, push them a little bit and say, no, this is where we want to go. I know we can do this. I know it's possible. Maybe we can't go this far, but I want to go further than what you're presenting here. So how do we, and that's kind of what we did when we built this building. Fortunately, we had an architect that was, it was Gensler, and they're pretty sustainability focused. And we were able to put together a good team of firms that understood, sustainability and the ESG goals and how to get there. But we still had to push them in some spots. We still had to say, no, we want to go a little further than that, and we want to see what this would look like. And so not just kind of accepting that first kind of proposal and saying how, kind of pushing a little bit on that. And I think as you do that, if more and more organizations do that, you end up with people better understanding how it happens. People get better at doing that. They get more comfortable with it. And so it's more likely that that's kind of what gets proposed in the future and such. And so
absolutely,
I think that's a key piece that we need to be kind of thinking about is, push a little bit.
Absolutely.
So.
And like I said, I think the more and more this becomes the normal conversation, the more and more people are going to get comfortable with it, and that will move that direction.
Right.
So, for people that are interested more about kind of what HARC does or how you might be able to help, what's a good way for people to get in touch with you, or what are some kind of final thoughts or ways that you think you can help people in the greater Houston area here?
Oh, absolutely. Well, one of the things we like to do is just kind of show people our building and show people what's possible here. There's a lot of different components and technologies that have come together to build a building that was not much more expensive than a typical kind of commercial office space build. And so we want to kind of just show off those technologies, plus how we kind of managed it, what systems we use to do that. And so what we do now is we work a lot with organizations that want to do sustainable facility management plans or climate action plans, or look at how do they optimize their the microgrids, or they're looking at microgrids. How can we help them optimize the size and the operation of those? Because in some cases you end up with one solution that it looks really green, but if you really do some analysis of it, it's actually greener if you go like with say a cogeneration plus solar plus storage versus just a solar plus storage. You may get resilience benefits as well as economic benefits. And so helping organizations make those types of decisions around what that would look like. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff we're kind of doing now is, how do you operate more sustainably?
Sure.
And what is the steps that you need to take, and how do you plan for that? We've also been working with some neighborhoods that are building kind of more sustainable overall kind of subdivisions and such, and helping them better understand, what are the resilient systems that need to go in place, whether if that's nature-based infrastructure or if that's your energy systems. And so for this particular organization, we're looking at microgrids in the common spaces and looking at different types of bioswale applications and nature-based solution applications. And so that's how we try to really work within the community is really help with kind of the planning and the design of things. We're not we're engineers. We're not implementers. We don't go in and build the stuff. We're not the construction company. We're not an architect firm. But we can help really do the kind of think through the planning and the design of it and what it should look like and how it should operate. And we end up doing a lot of third-party review of different types of projects and things like that as well. So
very cool. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, I will say, if you get a chance to come out and check out the building, it is very cool. I've only kind of halfway through my tour, I would say at this point, but it's just really impressive, the kind of the thought process that went into the design of the building, the way it was built, and the systems that it's using now currently to be able to operate. Very cool to see that. And even at a scope that, or a size building that maybe not think about be able to implement all these things, it's really cool to see them live and working. Right. So definitely encourage people to check that out. And then to contact y'all for all the other things that you talk about. Very, very cool things that you're doing, and definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, I think just the other, just real quick thing is that, you know, geothermal works. You know, we run into these people and they're like, oh, geothermal, I don't know if that works in Houston because of the soil composition. But, you know, it works. And so it's been a very efficient system. And I think people need to open up their eyes as far as what are the different types of, you know, HVAC systems that are possible. And it may work, it'll work on different scales. So in any case.
Sure.
But yeah.
No, fair enough. So Gavin, really appreciate you coming on the show and hosting me out here at the HARC facility, and kind of opening the doors a little bit to share what y'all have going on in this building, but also with your research and how it's impacting the community.
Great. Well, it's nice talking to you, Tim. I appreciate it.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Well, also want to thank all of you for watching or listening this episode of Building Value, and look forward to seeing you on the next one.